Welcome to Third Culture Leaders, where we dive deep into a world of those who grew up in between cultures. I'm your host, Murali Srinagaranadas, and together we'll explore the unique perspectives of those who grew up in a culture that's different from their parents. While this can be isolating, it also gives us the ability to create deep relationships and gain and embrace a global perspective. This podcast is a platform to share the stories of third culture leaders who have brought a global perspective to Canada. Let's reflect on those insights and take action. It was wonderful to have Neha Khera on the podcast.
You hear everyone say the best companies are created in a downturn, and that is without a doubt.
She has an incredible journey as a VC, leading 500 startups in Canada, 2048 in New York, and being an early investor in some of Canada's largest unicorns.
There's opportunities everywhere. Lean into the networks that you have.
If you're an entrepreneur or if you're an investor, this is the podcast for you. Enjoy. So Neha, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
I wanted to get started really on your parents' journey coming to Canada first, because I think you were born here, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Correct.
When did your parents come to Canada?
They came through a convoluted route.
Okay.
They landed in Canada in the early 80s, but left India in the mid 70s.
Okay.
Couldn't get immigration to US or Canada, but were so desperate to leave. So they were sort of like pie in the sky, who will accept us? And so they landed in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And
Wow.
They stayed there for 4 years. And Sao Paulo was actually a gateway into Canada because there were very few people trying to get out of Brazil into Canada. So after 4 years, they were able to apply for a visa to come to Canada, and then led to their journey as Canadians.
I thought you were going to say like someplace in Africa, because there's a lot of people
That's right.
coming from India to Africa. Okay.
No, it was, and they had to learn Portuguese. They became fluent in it. And so it became
Wow.
their secret language when my brother and I were growing up. And I know one word in
Oh, wow.
Portuguese. It's crianças, which means children.
Okay. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That must have been incredibly hard to learn, because I don't think Portuguese is related to any Indian language that I know of.
I think
Okay.
so, but I don't think there was much English, so they didn't have a choice.
Yeah. Wow. So they came in the 80s.
Yeah.
And was it Toronto right away?
No, it was, so my aunt was living in Hamilton. So they parked themselves with her. We lived in her house for a number of years while my dad got a job in Saudi Arabia. And so he left
Wow.
to go live in this closed community. And my mom joined him for about a year there. I'm born at this time. I'm now 2 months old or something crazy
Okay.
in Saudi Arabia in the middle of the desert. But it was too challenging for my mom.
Okay.
With 2 young kids, every time she would leave the compound, it was culturally just not a fit. So she came back. We lived with my aunt for several more years until my dad was able to send enough money for them to buy a home.
And so when did your dad come back?
It must have been sort of now creeping up to the mid 1980s. There was a period of about 3-4 years where I didn't see him very much. And actually, I have a vivid memory of being about 4 years old and him coming into our home and me asking him, "Are you really my dad?" Because I didn't have that period with him growing up, those formative years. And that stung. And I think shortly after that, he made the decision to leave Saudi and come back home.
Yeah, my dad was away most of my life as well, and I'm trying to think. I don't know if we just didn't connect for a long time, and I think you have certain expectations of how your kid should be, I guess, and obviously he was working hard to try to provide, but and then I became a teenager, and I'm sure that was a lot worse at that time. But I didn't really get to know him until I started working overseas with him in my 20s. But that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and I don't know about you and your dad if it impacted your bond, but I know it didn't for me. And so it's interesting how even though these formative years might be missed, you can make that time up.
Yeah, I mean, I always I always revered him, and I stayed with my grandparents. He was the only son, so he was spoiled to the max. Still is, I think my mom would say. But so I did have that bond, but I think we really got to know each other when, we were essentially co-founders. I don't think he would say I was a co-founder, but,
Yeah.
but a lot of the business, as we expanded our business, there's something when you're in the thick of things. And I don't know if this was the case with your father, but he really tried to shelter us from the financial struggles that we were going through. But when I was there with him, it was, right there in my face. So, but yeah, I didn't realize the Saudi connection as well. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think your dad's an engineer, right?
That's right. Yeah. They were hiring a lot of Canadian engineers back in those days to specifically his task was to put lighting up in the desert. So that's what they were working on.
Oh, wow.
Tax-free money. I mean, it was too good to give up, right?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are talking about that now too.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
We've come full circle.
So what was growing up, I guess in Hamilton first, but then what was growing up like for you?
Yeah, I mean, those early years, we started from scratch. We had no home of our own, no car, everything we were relying on my aunt for. That's why my first cousin and I, we are like sisters now because we grew up together in the same home. And, slowly then they were able to buy their first home, saved up enough, bought a second home. But I don't ever remember any of it being anything but just, I had my brother, I had my cousin, I had a lot of love. I had an aunt, a mother, uncles, and it just felt, a lot of love and a lot of family. And so even though I look back and I'm like, wow, we really didn't have very much. I remember we had a car where the doors would randomly just pop open. And so we laugh about it now, but I'm sure for my mom and, my mom's sister at the time, they were distraught. Like, why can't we provide better for our children? Yeah. But as a child, you don't think about it.
Yeah. Did they talk about, or do their expectations of Canada? And I mean, they stayed, so they were happy in some ways. But
they were very happy, and like a lot of immigrants, they did it for their children. They wanted the children to have a better life, and they were determined to work very, very hard to make sure that we had every opportunity. Similar story that I think a lot of immigrants go through, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, they saved up enough money to move us over to Oakville. So that's where I have most of my childhood memories. I was in grade 4, so about 9 years old, and stayed there through till the end of high school. And they were the kind of immigrants and the kind of parents that were preserving their culture, but were very, very keen to adopt the Canadian culture. They really worked hard to assimilate. My mom specifically, she was a social worker, so, really understanding nuance with culture and language. And she really worked hard to try to fit in, so to speak.
Yeah. That's important. I mean, I think there's some people who make the effort to do that, and some people who are kind of holding on to their culture and staying with their communities. It's nice to. I think the value of Canada is when you're able to mix.
I think so. Yeah. Someone was telling me, I think it's in Singapore, where they actually force cultures to mix by allocating certain people, a certain number of units in a building, for example.
Really? Oh,
and they're trying to prevent ghettoization. I think that's the right word.
Yeah.
As a result of that. And I actually think it's a smart strategy.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
The key for me was Folklorama in Winnipeg. Have you been to Folklorama?
No, but Prakash has spoken immensely about it. It brought all the cultures together, right?
Yes. And there you would meet kids and adults that would be just as confused, trying to figure things out, being in Canada with how does it mix with their own cultural heritage. But it was wonderful to have the youth ambassadors, the adult ambassadors, and seeing people appreciate different cultures and different foods was incredible. Yeah.
And you could use it as a form to be proud of your culture.
Yes, absolutely. Nice. And you're trying to figure out, I think, for us being Tamils, we understood what it meant to be Tamil Canadian. And seeing that, people talking about it, but seeing that practically was a huge eye opener for us. You missed out in Oakville.
I actually really did, because think about Oakville in the early 1990s. Diversity was certainly a blip on the radar.
Right.
So it was very Anglo, and I think in my entire high school there was like half a dozen Indian people. No one could pronounce my name, and I didn't have the gumption to correct anybody. It wasn't until I got to university that people actually said my name properly.
Yeah. And so you went to Waterloo.
I went to Waterloo.
Right? Yeah. And
I went to Waterloo, and that was the first time diversity hit me in the face. And I was like, I can have friends that are also first generation born Indians, and I clung to them.
Yeah.
Because suddenly, within the first 5 minutes of meeting these people, you had so much in common. And I did not get to experience that sort of up until my early 20s.
Yeah. So what did you do in Waterloo?
Engineering.
Engineering. Okay. There's all this talk about, having more women in STEM, and was that challenging going into engineering at that time?
I don't remember it. I don't remember it ever deterring me, and I don't remember it ever feeling like a burden. I don't know why. I think partly maybe because I grew up with an older brother, and I always felt a bit tomboyish, nerdy. I never felt out of my element.
Did he do engineering as well?
No, he became a doctor.
Okay.
We're checking off stereotypes.
Yeah. I remember it was doctor, lawyer, engineer. Yes. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But my dad was the engineer.
Yeah.
And I think he knew my love of building and tinkering from an early age. So both of my parents encouraged that in me, and were okay that I was, wanting to pursue something technical, which was, not necessarily the norm for women.
And so within engineering, was there was a specific field that you focused on?
Electrical. Yeah, and even till this day, computer and electrical engineering remain the lowest in terms of female.
Oh, interesting.
Other
Okay.
programs have gotten a lot more diverse, and they've actually introduced programs, specifically ones related to bio and health, that naturally attract more women. So the overall average of women has gone up. But when you look at it on a program by program basis, I don't think electrical is more than 10% till this day.
Did you know what you wanted to do once you got into engineering?
No,
or?
not a clue. Just lost
You
soul.
could have lied on the podcast.
No,
It's okay.
I didn't have a clue. I looked at engineering, and I looked at medicine, and I looked at my brother, and I thought, man, he's working really hard. And he's working really hard in his undergrad. And after that, he has to apply to medical school. And then it's another 4 years, and then another 4 years. I was like, too long. And I was like, what about engineering? 4 years, maybe 5 if you do Waterloo. You're a professional, go work.
Yeah.
It just seemed like the best bang for your buck. So that's
Yeah.
why I pursued it. And then I was naturally good at math. So I figured I'd do the degree and then figure out sort of where the world would take me after that.
So upon graduation, what were you looking at?
I knew, it was a co-op program, and I used a lot of my early co-ops to do traditional engineering type of work. I did hardware design, I did software development, I worked in traffic signals, I worked in telco, and towards the end, I realized I'm not so good at working, a technical job and keeping my head down. I'm more interested in the strategy and the business side of things, but I loved the world of tech. And so I wanted to stay in the world of tech, but get more on the business side. And so when I graduated, it was 2006. And so the world was still recovering from the big crash of the early 2000s in the tech world. And so you didn't have a lot of, you talk about FANG today, Facebook, Apple, Google, none of that existed. The only big tech companies hiring at the time were Microsoft and Expedia. And then you had a bunch of sort of ancillary large corporates that were trying to kind of dip their toe into this notion of tech innovation. Right. And so that's where I ended up. I ended up in banking, one of the big Canadian banks, in their innovation team, and spent a number of years there. But this was 2006. So fintech wasn't even a word yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy the banking industry?
I learned a lot. It was slow.
Yeah.
It was slow, but for a first job out of university, I think it was great.
Yeah. There was something I was watching where, everyone was talking about, I was watching a podcast with with one of my friends, Sam, and he was talking about how many kids just wanted to get into the banking sector because it was like the stable job. But tech was booming. You're right, in the early 2000s, that dot-com bubble, but there was still like, this is the rise of things like Amazon and all these companies that are now so huge, right?
Yeah.
What was the tech scene like then? Were you looking for opportunities then?
I don't think I was immersed in it. I was
Yeah.
in my bubble in the bank. If I had gone to the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, I probably would have bumped into a lot of these nascent companies, which are now the Amazons of the world, right?
Yes.
But I didn't. And
Yeah.
so in Canada and Toronto, I know the venture industry had fallen flat on its face. There really wasn't a lot happening. Oh, and entrepreneurship was not even a blip on the
Yes.
radar. I mean, we were not encouraged at all to consider starting our own companies
Yeah.
in Waterloo, unlike fast forward to 2024, right?
And so you then got into the VC space.
Yes.
Can you walk us through that pathway?
Yes. So I went and I did my MBA. After the bank, I said I need to be able to open up a financial post and understand it. I need to go get some education. So I got my MBA. I went to Ivy. And after that, I serendipitously landed in venture capital. Again, I did not really have a clear, picture of where I wanted to go. I just knew I wanted to stay in tech and I wanted to pursue really cool opportunities. And the thing about tech is it changes so fast. So it's hard to, pinpoint one thing you want to do. It's, I think, better to stay a little bit nimble. I ended up at the Mars Center in Toronto. And after about a year supporting entrepreneurs building businesses, I got roped into the venture capital team that's affiliated with Mars. Didn't have a clue what venture capital was all about or what it meant. But as I started to learn the ropes, I realized that I loved it. And fast forward 4 or 5 years from there, I realized that I, was decently good at it. So once you find that perfect combination, then you can start to build, deeper roots.
What is it that you loved about it?
It was constant learning and pushing yourself mentally. You're meeting these brilliant founders all day long, educating you about industries you didn't know about, problems you didn't know about. So that piece of it is what keeps the the work from ever feeling mundane. And then, I've always been an early stage investor. You're constantly thinking about where the world is going. And that's something that I naturally do anyway. Your head lives in the clouds. You're passively pulling in data from everything that you hear and see and look at, and daydreaming about what do I think the big trends are going to be that come up next. And so you're sort of applying that towards all these incredible people that you're meeting that are building businesses, and the marriage of the two just makes for really incredible work.
And was that around the time that you met the gents at Apply Board?
No, that was after I left Mars.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I went on to start my first fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how was that? Can you share a little bit about that experience?
About Apply Board?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So I met Apply Board in 2017. The founder, his name's Martin Basiri, him and his 2 brothers immigrated to Canada on student visas. They all went to Waterloo and they came here and they said, wow, that process was horrible.
That's an understatement,
of figuring out what schools, how to apply. And, they described the problem as also being quite, it was easy to get taken advantage of because on the ground in all of these different countries, there's agents, and these agents are the only conduit you have into these schools, and you don't know if you can trust these agents a lot of the time. So they wanted to simplify the process and also bring a lot of transparency into it, and that was the genesis for Apply Board. Now, from what I remember, they started it as a consulting company, just helping students one-off. And shortly after that, they realized if we just build some tech around this, we can help a heck of a lot more students.
Right.
And so they did, and that was the genesis of the company. And when I met them, they were doing at about $30,000 in revenue, And you could just see that it was really starting to take off. The students were loving it. The schools were loving having this, one platform through which they could manage all of their intakes and all of their applications. And combine that with the founder and the CEO, Martin, who is an absolute visionary. Absolute. He is one of the most passionate founders and entrepreneurs I've ever met. So it wasn't a very hard decision to make, to write him a check. And I was a small check. We weren't a large check, but needless to say, I think that was the beginning of a really great relationship, and I admire him a lot.
Did you use him as a template for other people you would invest in? Like, what are the kinds of things that you look for in founders?
So at that time in my venture career, I was building a basket of companies. I think during that year specifically, I made 16 investments in all kinds of founders. Founders like Martin, who were new immigrants, and all the way through to founders who weren't immigrants and who were, had a lot of pedigree, and maybe they were repeat founders. Looking back, because as a VC, the only thing you really can rely on is the data from what you've done.
Right.
So when I look back on that period and I look back on that data, without a doubt, the companies that became outliers and outperformed were the ones that were all happened to be started by immigrants.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons, and it's not to say the others don't perform, but I think with that immigrant mentality, it's do or die. That level of tenacity and that hustle is unmatched. And, they have everything to lose and nothing to lose all in the same breath.
Do you think it's, I know you mentioned there's a lot of characteristics. Do you think it's also, the challenges, perhaps economically, that they're facing as they come for some immigrants, not all? Or is it a different perspective that they bring, a different business style, perhaps? What are your thoughts there?
I think in some cases, they have unique knowledge that they've brought from their home countries. For example, I had also invested in a jewelry company. The founders were Jordanian, and they were third-generation jewelers from back home. They came into this country and they said, wow, there is a real gap in the jewelry market here, and we think we can fill it. And oh, by the way, we know everything about this market from our unique experiences back home. So that's
Right.
an unmatched experience, or what we call founder market fit.
Right.
So I think that definitely plays into it. And then I think on the other hand, it's the adversity that they've lived. Having left their home country, not a lot of people ever get to experience that in their lives. And when I look at my children, they certainly have not, and I don't know if they ever will.
Yeah.
Right?
Do you think, I think about that a lot too, actually, Neha, thinking, there was a lot of, when you talked about your childhood, mine was very similar. I don't think that maybe someone would look back and say, oh, we were kind of struggling. And I would say, looking back on it myself, we were, but I never felt that as a kid.
No.
And again, because of the love and support my parents, grandparents, and aunts and uncles gave. But, going to, I went to St. Paul's, like a private school. So seeing kids have all these opportunities that I didn't have really opened my eyes to that, and I think kind of gave me that drive. Again, not that I was unhappy with the situation that we were in. I was actually very happy, but I knew there was something to work towards. I don't know if my kids are going to get that. I don't know, but we try to provide for our children, but I wonder, how can you bring in that grit? I'm actually thinking of going to another country for a couple of years and coming back. Maybe that will give them that kind of resilience, right?
Of course. You try as a parent to protect them. You don't want them to face what it is that we faced, and yet what we faced was an amazing childhood.
Yes.
So it's this weird conundrum where I don't know. I think I don't. It's hard to parent in 2024 when you have had such a different upbringing than you're trying to provide your kids with.
Do you, and again, I don't know how it was growing up for you, but how much was like Indian culture prevalent as a child for you?
It was a constant, but it was never sort of forced upon us. So we weren't forced into like Hindi school. We weren't forced to take sort of Indian dancing or anything of that nature, but it was a constant at home. Like, my parents would pray and we would go to temple maybe once every few weeks. And then as we got older, it was, we hope you take some of this with you and internalize it. And I think till this day, my mom repents a little that maybe she didn't force more of it on us. But like I said, they were also trying very hard to, acclimate and become more Canadian. So I think they, unlike some of my friends, I'm probably the least Indian, quote unquote,
Sure,
as a result of that. And I struggle with my own children. I don't know what the heck to teach them. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, it is also, again, those challenges between these cultures,
Yes.
right? We also had it quite similar. We prayed, we went to temple, and I went to a Catholic school, so we went to church as well. So confused in many ways. But I also think those were great foundations for us to, I think, as your parents said, maybe you may keep it or you may not, but at least it's something that you can lean back on.
Yeah. And the role of religion has changed a lot too.
Yes.
It's become a lot more internalized.
Yeah.
I think what religion did is it brought community together. And I think that piece has gone missing now
Yes.
from society. So if we can find a way to bring that back, I think that's what the most important piece is.
Yeah. We had my cousins had a wedding this weekend in Winnipeg. So we had it at the temple. And it was really nice to see, first of all these different cultures come, their friends and family, to experience that event. But also nice to see that different positions in the family have a role to do. Like I had to break the coconut as part of the ceremony, and then my other cousins and my sister was in the wedding party, etc. Like I really appreciate cultural traditions like that are incorporating every person in the family and bringing these different ages together. And we think about that a lot actually in my company at 369 Global, where we're focused on, diversity in terms of ethnic origin or work experience, but also age. Thinking about, for us, we have 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-olds in our company, and thinking about a 20-year-old and 70-year-old in a boardroom having a conversation about some project we're doing is extremely interesting and extremely frustrating at the same time, but important, because I think that's where you get these great nuggets of wisdom. So when you look at the tech sector, I mean, you've seen so many different companies in so many different industries. Are you seeing it as a very like young generation kind of industry, or are there different generations coming into the fold?
Yes and no. I think stereotypically you think of a founder as this young university grad who's going to one of these, Silicon Valley accelerators, and that certainly holds true. But the average age, I think, is closer to mid-40s, which is probably not surprising. What you are right about, though, is there is ageism after a certain point. As soon as you're sort of like past 50s and you're trying to start a company and go fundraise, I think you're going to get a lot of quizzical looks, as in, really? Aren't you sort of at that tail end of your career now? So you don't see a lot of folks kind of beyond that. Be successful with sort of the venture capital side of things, and it's not right.
Yeah,
but
it's unfortunate
it
because
is.
The experience that they have, I think, could really help companies, look at the data, and with someone that's been in the industry for a while can share some insights that maybe they might not generally see just with the data alone.
Totally. Yeah. But you're right. I think when you look at companies, if a company is started by, say, someone in their early or mid 30s, they're generally hiring folks that are younger than them. So,
Yeah.
the average age in these companies does tend to skew younger until that company reaches a point where, okay, now we got to grow up. We got to get in some, been there, done that type of blood. And then they start to bring in the quote unquote gray hair.
And how does that translate to the VC space? Is it similar, or is it a older generation that you see?
VC is kind of divided between the old school and the new school. You do have the old school, the ones that kind of lived through that dot-com crash, and then you've got a ton of people who are younger. So I think there's a wide spectrum in the VC space.
I wonder what the data shows who's doing better.
Oh, we're going to have to look that up.
I think it'd be interesting because they're, going back to people who have gone through adversity.
Yeah.
I think it'd be interesting to see folks who've gone through the dot-com bubble. I'm sure the 2008 financial crisis also had an effect.
And the one that we're in now, right?
Yeah.
This is all cyclical, and I think there's a lot of learnings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was I watched your panel discussion on collision last year in 2023.
Yeah.
So I hope you remember everything, because I have a list of questions here that I'm going to ask you. I'm joking, but it was an interesting time looking at 2023. Just for folks who haven't seen it, some of the highlights were you and other guests were talking about some of the challenges in terms of deal flow, some of the challenges in terms of really. I think it's still here, but not looking at growth, but really, do you have a quality product and service that you can stand the test of time? Are you working towards that, et cetera? And AI also came up there. How are you seeing things now in 2024? Has things changed? Do you see some lights at the end of the tunnel?
No, I don't know. Not to say I don't see light at the end of the tunnel, but I don't think a lot has changed. I think it's pretty status quo to last year. I think it's still very challenging for companies to raise capital. And I think the bar has continued to remain high for startups that are out there. But if you do have capital to deploy, you hear everyone say the best companies are created in a downturn. And that is without a doubt, because the founders that are building right now, they can really stomach the fact that the market is challenging. And they're building because they are so bullish on what it is that they're trying to make,
Right.
So there's fewer founders, but I feel like the ones that are out there are really, really, really amazing.
So are you looking at founders, when you connect with founders now, I think, it's about relationship at the end of the day. What is your, I don't know if you can pinpoint it to something specific, but I'll ask anyway. Is there like a life cycle you think about in terms of relationship building? Especially now, they might not be looking for funding. It might not be wise for them to get funding now. How are you staying connected with folks in the space?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, as a VC, you sort of know your role. You know when your role is important, and you know when your role has an expiry date. So, for example, I'm an early stage investor. The best time for me to meet a founder is as they're thinking about starting a company. Maybe they've already started it. Now they're thinking about raising some capital. Anywhere along that life cycle, it's good for me to meet them and start building that relationship. Now that expires at some point. Once that company sort of gets 24, 36, 48 months into their journey, now they've probably reached a place of product market fit. They're in rapid growth. They're throwing money behind a lot of growth and marketing. They're looking for the next, second or third round of funding. That's not my expertise. So you sort of hand that relationship off to the next investor, and you're okay with, I'm taking a back seat. We'll keep in touch, but I don't need to be your go-to for every little problem now.
Interesting. Are you interested in getting to that next space, or are you comfortable or happy with where in the angel investing sector?
In the early stage investment sector is where I'm comfortable. Yeah, for sure. Because that's the muscle that I've built. That's the track record I've built up. And every stage really has a unique skill set associated with it, right?
Absolutely.
For us, we're not really diving into business models and looking deeply into numbers and KPIs around growth, because these companies are day zero.
Yeah.
But for an investor coming in at Series A or a B, they're really turning over the table on the financial model and the projections and looking deeply into all the numbers.
Yeah. What does the tech space look like for not only Canadian companies, but companies thinking about coming to Canada? Are you bullish on the Canadian tech landscape?
I am bullish on Canadian tech founders, without a doubt. So that includes Canadian tech companies. What I am not bullish on are companies that build only for Canada. I don't know if we necessarily have a large market to support them. Obviously, there are, exceptions to this rule if you're on the consumer side, if you're a fintech, but by and large, Canada is a great place for founders, for talent to build out your teams, but all roads lead outside of Canada when it comes to sales and marketing and growth. It has to. It's just not big enough.
Do you see opportunities, like a lot of people look at the US, do you see opportunities globally, like in Asian markets, African markets? I don't know about Europe, but maybe Asia and Africa.
Yeah, no, Europe's growing a lot too.
Yeah.
I mean, there's opportunities everywhere. I think the challenge is you have to lean into the networks that you have and the people that you know. For me to, saunter into Vietnam and try to pinpoint a strong founder and a strong idea, it's nearly impossible.
Right.
Culturally, it's too different. I don't understand the nuances of the problems that are, happening there. So that's why it's better to lean into sort of the culture And in Canada, that includes both Canada and the US. I mean, we're close in proximity, but also very close in culture, right?
Yes.
So, but the difference with Canada right now is there is a real lack of funding.
Yeah.
So if you do believe that Canada has great talent and great founders and great entrepreneurs, and you tie that in with the lack of funding, that equals a real opportunity right now to go after.
Yes. So what is the future looking like for you, Neha? What are you up to?
Yeah.
How can folks connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to continue on my early stage journey. I'm not publicly announcing yet what it is I'm working on. Morale knows, but it will be about bringing more capital into the early stage ecosystem in Canada, focused specifically on Canadian entrepreneurs. And people can reach out to me on LinkedIn or however else. I'm all over the internet, so it shouldn't be too hard.
Well, it's really great to see someone of your caliber continue to invest in founders here in Canada. I think it's very much needed. You have a few unicorns under your belt, so we're very excited to see what the next ones will look like. And thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. This was great.